Let's talk about naming things in your novel, whether it's people or places or things. And this does not just apply to fantasy, although it definitely applies to fantasy. I have put off doing this video for a while because it feels really simple to me, but I actually have 4 different methods. So in case this inspires you or gives you an idea that you hadn't thought of, I thought I would share. So let's start with some of the more obvious methods just to get those out of the way. The first one is Pinterest. You can do all kinds of searches like modern names or classic names or unique names or names from such and such language, etc. And you can find so many cool options. I like to save a bunch to a board, usually a hidden board, and I actually save more than I need. Just like every name that sticks out to me, I save it because I might be at a point in the novel writing process where I'm like, dang it, I have a new character, I didn't see them coming, I need a name for them. And so I can just pop over to the board and be like, oh, here's one that I haven't used yet, let's just use that for now. Maybe as a placeholder, or maybe it fits perfectly. So yeah, it's pretty self-explanatory, but I find that the Pinterest method helps me save time during the drafting process because I don't have to spend a ton of time on research because I've done it already. Number 2 is baby name websites. And I probably should have just gone with this first, right? Because I think this would actually be the most obvious, and it's the one where we all go to at some point, but I just feel like for me, when I use these, sometimes the websites seem a little bit scammy, a little bit like if you click on the wrong thing, you're gonna get a virus. I tend to not use these as much for that reason, but come to think of it, you could technically just go to a physical library and get a physical baby name book as well. Pretty sure they still have those. So that's definitely an option. Number 3 is probably the one I've done the most across all my books. I don't do it for every single character, but I really love searching based on the meaning of a name. So for example, let's say I have a character and I want her story arc to be that she has hope, or maybe that's the lesson that she learned or something like that, is like she's finding hope. But to actually name her Hope would be a little bit too on the nose. So I might like Google and search names that mean hope. And then depending on my story, obviously it would matter which ones that I lean towards, but like maybe I'm writing a fantasy, so I'm like, oh my gosh, Phoenix is perfect. Or maybe it's more contemporary, so I'm like Jessie. I just love that extra symbolism and tie-in. Even if readers don't know, it feels right to me, so I really enjoy that kind of naming. And number 4, last but not least, this is what I would call the most complicated, I guess, but really the coolest way to name things. And as I've started to get into fantasy more and more, I've just found that this helps make all of your characters and your world and just your like culture of the world in general feel more cohesive, and that is to base it on the real world and use the real world for inspiration. So just to clarify, I'm just talking about using it as a starting place. Like you could rewrite the spelling of things or play around with like changing all the endings of some words or something, or you could take 2 different languages and mesh them together, which I think sounds really cool. But the thing about languages is if you go to different places in the world, you will recognize where you are based on the sound of the language. There's just something really beautiful about languages, and I honestly think this is such a cool thing that you can take advantage of, especially when you're writing like a fantasy story. Although of course in contemporary stuff this would also apply. Like you would want to pick a specific location, right? You don't want to have like names from all over the world. If you're specifically in Spain or something, you'd want to have Spanish names. Again, the reason that I believe this works is because languages all have their own unique melody and structure that the ear recognizes. So there's a bunch of different ways you could do this. You could just literally go onto Google Maps and like scroll around until you find like a really interesting location. And again, this could work with contemporary where you just literally like plop your story into that real world location. Or when it comes to like fantasy, which is what I write, you would more use that as a starting place. You could also go back in time to some like historical location instead, because for example, the English language is not the same now as it was in the past. So like you can use different real world inspiration and then you can go ahead and let it evolve from there the way that languages naturally do anyway, but you can like intentionally evolve it for your story, if that makes sense. So for example, in the Stolen Kingdom series and now the Queen's Rise series, which I'm currently writing, I have a people group called Jinn, right? And I based their, not necessarily their language, because again, this is fantasy, so we're not saying that this is the entire world is based in this exact exact place, but the names in particular for the people and for places I based on biblical names. So I kind of went back in time, kind of used a mishmash, because technically there's a lot of Hebrew going on, so I also played into that, but there's also some Greek going on, and so I played into that as well when I was creating their culture, and I created this kind of mash up, so to speak. And then when it came to humans, I used Persian names so that it would sound very separate, so that when these two people groups met, they don't sound like they belong in the same culture, which is my goal. And again, just disclaimer, I am not saying to base your entire fantasy novel on an actual real place, because for me that's not the goal at all. And I have this one super irritating review of a person who thinks that I was setting my fantasy novel in contemporary Iran, and so they're like critiquing it based on how it doesn't line up, and I get frustrated because I'm like, do you not know what fantasy is? Do you not understand that I'm not basing it off the real world? I'm just taking elements from the real world that you might recognize, that might make it feel familiar, and that most importantly might make it feel realistic in your fantasy world as well, because it's based on reality. And that's what I think really makes a reader go, that makes sense. I feel like cultures would do that, or that makes sense. I feel like those names go together. I feel like this person's world sounds real. And a big part of that does come from the names that you choose. And so that's why I find it so fascinating and fun to kind of go off of an area or a people group or even something in the past in history. It's really fun. But I would also encourage you to try deviating from it slightly. Sometimes, you don't have to always, but like for example, it could be really minor. Like I have a character who I love, his name is Malachi, and there's like the biblical spelling, and then I just slightly tweaked it because I was actually going to go even further in my changes and give him like a nickname Kai, which is not in the Bible at all as far as I'm aware. That would allow me to have like a starting place, but then I make it my own. Does that make sense? Or let's say you love the sound of Spanish words. I'm using Spanish again because I actually, when I was growing up, I wanted to be a Spanish exchange student. We had exchange students from Japan, and I thought it was the coolest thing, and I was like, I'm gonna go to Spain, and I was trying to learn Spanish, and I just think the language is really beautiful. And so you could start out, right, by using like the first word for a city is a Spanish word, but then you give every city like a name that's 2 words, and the second word could be like all the same word, and it's just like cohesively ties them together, but it's not Spanish. Or it could be a bunch of different words, and you're just putting them together. And so what happens with things like that is that human nature, we recognize something familiar, but we also recognize that it didn't go together, and so it makes it something new, and it feels natural and real, while at the same time creating a brand new place, a brand new experience for the reader. Oh my gosh, I just remembered this TikTok video where it was like the funniest thing ever. They were like, every fantasy book that you ever read, went to visit and they went to see their friend Bob. You know, and it's like, yeah, that is how reading some fantasy books are, where you're like, I actually don't know how to say this. So I find that basing it again on real world inspiration can really help with that and make it feel less like nonsense names, you know what I mean, with just like all consonants or something. If it's based on reality, I mean, it could be a reality that the reader's not familiar with, so they might still not know how to pronounce things, and that's fine. That's why I have a glossary in my book. But yeah, I just think it's really fun to actually use real world inspiration. All right, so again, like I said at the beginning of this video, all 4 of these methods are pretty straightforward and simple. I am not like going to be, what's his name? Tolkien, right? Who invented his own brand new language, although if you want to do that, you absolutely can. But I just feel like these 4 methods have been really valuable to me, so I hope they sparked inspiration for you. Let me know in the comments if you enjoyed any of them, or if any of them were brand new and you didn't think to do that way, then that would be really fun for me to hear. But otherwise, I will talk to you guys again very soon. Bye!